A very warm welcome to everybody for this next edition of our Leaders for Humanity series. And I'm extremely proud to have with us today a great thinker, an inspiration, and a personal friend, Simon Weston. Simon, hello and welcome to you.
Hello, Otti. Good to be here.
Wonderful. It's great to see you. And of course, also a warm welcome as usual to my co-host, Antoinette. And the topic for today's session will be the quest for eco-centric leadership beyond the Church of Capitalism. And I think we will have lots of very interesting questions and hear a little bit more from Simon about these topics. But as always, before I go anywhere else, I will briefly introduce the flow. And those of you who have joined some of these sessions, it's the same as usual. So a very brief note about our Good Organizations project, then a proper presentation of Simon and some reflections from Simon on his kind of personal upbringing. And you will learn, Simon is always saying, every development is biographical, and there's a necessity to locate ourselves and understand from where we are speaking. And in Simon's book, that is something that he spends quite a bit of thinking and time on, and I'm very happy to try to replicate that a little bit here. And then we will go into the dialogue as usual, trying to touch on what is a good organization in the context of the good life of the individuals and the good society. Which brings me immediately to our Good Organizations project. Antoinette and I launched this project about, I think, 3 or 4 months ago. And our inquiry is about how can organizations become good in this complex and fast changing world. How do organizations develop their ability to be responsible and sustainable at 3 levels: as actors inside society, trying to contribute to a good society and the commons, as a container for the individuals and the relationships they have with the communities that are part of the organizational system, and finally as a breeding ground, as an enabler for the individuals to become developed and mature and lead a good life as employees of the organization. And we're trying to engage in this inquiry, different communities of free thinkers, of academic researchers who bring some evidence, of individuals like Simon who have very important viewpoints across practice and academia. And finally, we try to involve also business leaders and political leaders to take this thought forward and actually make it practical. That's our ambition. It's going to take probably a while until we get some traction on this. But please bear with us and let's do this together. And with that, without any further ado, Simon Weston, the CEO of Analytic-Network Coaching. Antoinette.
Yes, and I'm very glad that you're with us, Simon, because for me as a scholar, I find it fascinating that you are one of the few reflective scholars who is really able to bridge towards practice. And of course, we see that already with you having your own institute on Analytic-Network coaching, and now you are also the founder of the Eco-Leadership Institute, we learned. And then if we go through your biography, it looks very impressive on a number of other levels as well, because you are still active researcher associated via senior fellowship teachings to very interesting institutions such as the Tavistock Institute, Lancaster University, Birkbeck, Birmingham. I mean, I couldn't stop if I would go on here. But at the same time, we can already see just in the bullet points here that you have also had and still have a practical career. You were a trained nurse, you studied psychology and worked as a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So it's really amazing. But what for me was even, I would really say I was humbled. I even wrote that to you, is when I looked at your biography where you try to locate yourself, what Otti was already talking about. Because what really stood out for me is your vast experience in working in different suffering machines. And I mean, this is exactly what we want to go at. So you were working in factories, in nursing wards, in reformative therapy providers, and in universities, and notably, these were also suffering machines. And I think it's from there, at least you developed that so nicely, that you got a deeply felt moral conviction as well. So that power, for instance, needs to be devolved. Humanism and equality seems to be core for you. constructive dissent, emancipation are needed. And of course, I could always read that humor is your great way to cope. So I also, of course, like that a lot. And in that sense, I'm really looking forward because at least I will be able to learn a lot, I'm already sure. And in order not having me telling your life story all the time, we also brought with some questions so you can bring some more of your own ideas about this. And I would really just give you first the floor and ask you, how would you describe yourself with a few attributes?
You've silenced me. How would I describe myself? I have no idea where to begin. I mean, I've had a very intriguing life and interesting life. I think I describe myself as a curious person. I think curiosity is kind of at the heart of who I am. And throughout my life, I've always been curious and always been questioning, and that's, I guess, been one of my major drivers. And yeah, intellectually curious, curious to travel, curious to explore ideas, places, people, relationships, nature. I think that's kind of at the heart of what my experience is. And my experiences just shape me, shape my thinking, shape who I am. I'm very conscious of how the social speaks through us. Otti will be familiar with me saying this on my coaching program. You know, how we are not just individual beings, autonomous, free thinkers. We're actually formed by experience. We're actually formed by culture, formed by social. And I pay a huge amount of attention to that in my own life and with others I'm working with and meet. So that's kind of what I'm about, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And Simon, one thing that, as Antoinette said, you've gone through all these different life phases and different experiences that you also describe in your books. I was intrigued by one, and it will reflect again on the conversation we're having between spirituality and faith. You joined the Quakers and you joined the Anglican Church. So what was the impact of that, and how did this bring another dimension to your thinking?
Well, it's interesting. When I was young, my mother was like loosely religious. I think we went to church a few times, but she was very influenced by practical religion. So when she was in her teenage, she went to London. She came from a very poor background, and she was picked up by the Methodist Church, and she said they saved me, and they educated her, and she became a teacher, and she got her own career, which she loved, and that was through engaging some working class women in the East End of London who were kind of had a Christian ethos and picked her up. So she was imbued by that kind of practical Christianity. And but as I grew up, I mean, I grew up in a secular Britain. All my friends are secular, and you know, we did the drinking thing and partying thing, and no one paid much attention. But I was always interested in faith, and it was weird. You know, we go traveling, and I'd end up always be in a mosque or a temple, or I was always drawn. You know, we go to the Glastonbury Festival, and I'd be the one hanging out in a Hare Krishna tent, and there was something which was internally inside me which kind of drew me to religious and faith practices. And when I used to like have big arguments, you know, by this kind of big kind of patriarchal God telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And it didn't kind of make much sense to me, the way I understood religion. And Quakerism was beautiful because I went there when I had my first child at the age of 26, and I used to take him there because there was free juice and biscuits, and we used to go and sit in the Quaker room, and on the wall there'd be these messages, and it was a very socially, practically orientated religion, and it's very much not doctrinal. So it's very much about kind of finding your own way into faith. And it was cool for me because it meant that I could actually practice faith without kind of being told what I should and shouldn't believe, and that was really informative. And the Quakers organize in the most interesting way. I don't know if you know anything about the Quakers, but they have this incredible organization where it's the nearest you get to a leaderless group, and you go to an annual meeting, and they have a business meeting, and you can have 6,000 Quakers trying to make decisions through consensus, through spiritual consensus, they call it. And it's about being guided by the Spirit. And it's just a fascinating practice. And later on, I joined the Anglican Church in Ireland because there were not many Quakers here. And there is a question mark for me around the Quakers. They're perhaps a bit too liberal now. They've almost become a humanistic organization where they believe everything and anything, and they've lost any attachment to scripture or to God, I think. So it's interesting, the journey I've been on.
Very interesting. And I think two topics will certainly come back to us. One, your analysis also of some of the fundamentalist movements and the American church, and especially when we talk about leadership. And I think your inquiry with some of the monastic practices when it comes to leadership development. So I will put them on our backlog and go back to Antoinette for another question on your life.
Well, I would have to say, after having heard this, I guess that you have a good idea about what the good life is for you. And that is something I would be interested as well. What is the good life for you?
The good life for me is being in a place where I feel healthy, where I feel like I'm flourishing, where I'm exploring my curiosity. But it also means having a full range of emotions. I mean, one thing I don't talk about in my biography and in my life story, which I don't keep hidden. It's at the front of my book, so I leave traces of it, and it comes out. But I've had a life of grief as well. Huge amount of grief in my life. Huge amount of loss. Which is I don't talk about it too much, and I won't talk about it a lot here because it's just too painful. But it's my life's been marked by grief, and it's and part of living a good life is actually accepting that as part of who I am, and like being able to live with sadness and happiness and struggle. I've always accepted that life's a struggle. I don't expect it not to be a struggle. Mm-hmm. And it's about how you engage in that struggle and how you engage with the challenges around you. I mean, being healthy and having family and having being close to nature. There's lots of things which kind of mean to me help me have a good life. But it's about having kind of an engagement with a full range of emotions and being fully human and fully kind of engaged in the world.
Very, very nice. And I think, Simon, I know you, of course, but I think our listeners will also already get that sentiment, how much you are inquisitive with yourself and with the relationships and able to take these observer positions that we will talk a lot about later. I want to ask one more question, which is maybe also a little bit practical, because you've seen so many different aspects of the puzzle, maybe of the puzzle of life. Are there any people that have really taught you something valuable about the good life, about how to live a responsible life that you would recommend to others? Many people, and it's been. There's not like, I wouldn't like point to a charismatic leader and say that person would, but when I was on a psychiatric ward, just watching a young 23-year-old schizophrenic terribly suffering. I mean, we use words like schizophrenic loosely, but when you actually work with somebody who's suffering with voices in their heads and being persecuted, and the pain you see, and actually you see the courage and the bravery, and sometimes the reaching out and the gentleness. So someone like that who actually, I can learn so much off someone like that, as well as some kind of more than some kind of a wonderful guru who's kind of done some amazing things. So everywhere in my life, I've been touched by people. I was talking to someone the other day about working in the asylum, and they were asking me, and I said, there's this one charge nurse, someone in charge of a group of patients, and the asylum was a very painful place to work in. Like, it was a total institution, and there's quite a lot of cruelty there. It was quite difficult. And this one person just created an environment of kindness and generosity, like with these long-term patients who were never going to leave. He created a kind of farm for them. He took them out to the pub. And the most difficult patient who was very, very disturbed, he used to take him once a week to his own family. It's like quite a dangerous thing to do, because this person was, really, really quite psychotic and disturbed, but he knew that this person needed some humanity and human loving. And so people like that, you meet on a journey, and I've met in monasteries and some monks who just live very simple lives. And I've been
I think if you're open to being touched by people, you find these people everywhere. It's a
Very
bit like
nice. And it reminds me, Antoinette, almost of this discussion we had with Carol Sanford about non-heroic leadership. And I think, well, again, and I'm sure Antoinette will point to that, this mutuality. Tomorrow we're going to talk to Bill Torbert, the mutuality of this power that can lighten up our lives and being open to that. Beautiful. As always, I will position briefly now the inquiry and then hand over to Antoinette to start with the first aspect of it. Let me bring up the slides again. So what we always do, again, for those that have followed some of these will know, we will try to look at three things. What is a good business in the context of a good society, or what is good business as the economy, as the total? What are good organizations as the individual actors, and what are good leaders? And this goes back to the notion of what is a good life in the context of work. And we will turn things around for Simon a little bit, because Simon has written a lot about leadership. So we will go from what is good and what is the good society and business within that to good leadership, and then finish off, if we have time, with good organizations and get Simon's thoughts. And I will hand it back to Antoinette to start us off on the good society and what is good question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say for any students who would ever watch it, that they can really learn a lot here, because you are really reflective, and it is, of course, also part of the research and how you do research. So this is really like, they should watch and listen. And I think what is as natural, if we hear you, is that you turn to critical theory, which in itself is an ethical and emancipatory framework. But maybe you want to explain it first in your own terms. What is the essence of critical theory to you?
Yeah, I mean, critical theory to me, it's funny. It was I came across it at Lancaster University, and it was like someone saying, well, it was someone saying like, oh, that's what you've been doing for the last 10 years. It's like, I didn't know I've been doing that, but that's kind of what I have been doing. And it was asking these deeper questions, not taking for granted. For me, critical theory is really about two things. One is not taking for granted normative assumptions. So the way things are, it's about not just accepting normative assumptions, always asking a different question and looking at what's beneath the surface. So in my framework, I think about depth analysis, using discourse analysis, using psychoanalysis, using any way to look beneath the surface, like what's going on, what hidden things are happening beneath the surface. I use looking awry from Zizek, thinking about how we can look differently at situations. And I think this is incredibly important at the moment. I think we're just so conditioned to look in certain ways, and even critical theorists have this problem. They often look in the same way, and they get stuck in the same patterns as everybody else. So looking awry is important. It's like I use the analogy of a filmmaker who kind of does a camera shot from a different angle, and it shows a completely different perspective on the same scene. And network analysis, I think, is important, about really thinking about these ecosystems and this ecocentric way of thinking beyond just kind of what's in front of us. But the other thing about critical theory is this emancipatory framing. Quite often that gets forgotten or left out. It's sort of people in critical theory often just fall into critiquing and then pulling apart, saying kind of that's bad and that's bad and that's bad. And that's kind of easy, But what about kind of reconstructing? Deconstruction is easy. What about reconstructing? And that's what I do in my book. I'm happy to deconstruct, but only if we're going to do the work of reconstructing as well, rebuilding in a more emancipatory and liberatory way. So that's what it means for me.
Very interesting. Do you want to come in?
Go ahead, Otti. I was just kind of shortly confused because, as usual, my cat was walking by, and that's just not
the mysterious cat is traversing the screen. Simon, we've read a lot about critical management science, and we were quite intrigued that you're actually citing Paul Adler a lot. And Paul is one of the next guests that we will have on the show, so to speak, on our inquiry. And maybe a few more theoretical questions, at you just very briefly. So critical management theory, in Paul's words, is an amalgamation of people who are not believing that the current paradigm, so to speak, is conducive to solving some of the big challenges we've got in society today. And maybe also from an from an ontological standpoint is not the reality. And I think, as you say, it's very pervasive. So could you maybe and I don't know to what degree that is part of your vocabulary, but could you maybe describe a little bit what the dominant paradigm is in society today against which some of this critical thinking is positioned? And in that context, could you touch on constructionism and pragmatism in that context? Is that part of your framing, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm actually probably critical of critical thinking these days. So I think my thinking's moved on. Actually, it's interesting. Since I was at the university, for me it was I love being at Lancaster University because there were some brilliant scholars there, really great scholars there, and it was like, wow, it kind of put me in my place. I kind of thought, this is unbelievable. I didn't have the earlier education, so I didn't study philosophy or anything. And it was like, oh my God, these great minds, and but they were some seriously kind of interesting thinkers, and I'm glad I went there. But I think critical thinking and critical theory is actually a part of modernity, and I think it's like the ethos of modernity we have to question at the moment. So the ethos of modernity, like, it is really it's a way of thinking, way of being, and the way I'm moving, the way I'm thinking now is much more about trying to think differently and drawing on people like Donna Haraway, drawing on indigenous thinkers, drawing on queer theory, which questions the modernity, questions what Jacques-Alain Miller would call science capitalism. It's sort of, it pulls us apart. So, I still think critical theory is important, and critical thinking to question capitalism, to question neoliberalism, to question kind of the way things are, dominant ways of thinking. But I don't think it does enough. I think it's actually part of the problem.
And so quick follow-up. So Paul Adler, of course, is a proponent of democratic socialism. And a lot of the CSM, so the critical CMS, the critical management science, is based on some of the Marxist theories, at least for part of the people in that space. So what is your view on societal change? Is that something that is prevalent in your thinking, or is it more about the individual?
Well, like Marxism and social, I was always a critique of it from a young age. So I'd always refused to call myself a socialist or Marxist, and I used to use the label anarchist just because I wasn't happy with the way socialism kind of and Marxism has it's born from modernity. It's born from this idea of progress, linear progress. The class would emancipate itself if it goes through these processes, and it's actually just a flip side of capitalism. So and as we see in practice, it's not worked that well in societies where it's been tried. So I think modernity is a way of thinking which lost so much from pre-modernity, and I think the enchanted world of pre-modernity clearly had lots of magic and lots of problems with that, and different power relations with different shamans and gurus holding power. But it also had a great wisdom in that we lived in an entangled and connected life, and like socialism is very human-centric. It's all about humanity, and it doesn't talk about multi-species. It doesn't talk about the wider entanglements of nature and the environment and the ecosystems in which I'm writing about. So it kind of misses a big part of that. It still would use nature as a resource, to support humanity. So I think there's a kind of a missing piece there. And I think my work and thinking is, I'm quite excited at the moment about going beyond that and finding a different language to take into organizational work.
So one of the questions we had for you, I think we have now already ticked it, because we wanted to ask you whether emancipation in itself is not also colonial. But it seems that's exactly what you just told us in fine words. So, but let me still go to this ethical idea, which at least in your books, you place also in the context of the critical theory. What is there still a good society in a universal kind of sense, and what is the good society then?
I don't think there is in the universal sense a good society. I think the good society is something we have to debate work with, contest. Chantal Mouffe, I think, talks about democracy, like always having antagonisms there, like you have to have antagonisms. So I think for me, the good society is something which is forever being questioned. And I use it in my work still. I find it quite a useful concept because when I'm running a class, I say to people, like, the good society is not some utopian idea out there. Yes, we do want to end world poverty. Yes, we do want to kind of stop the environment being damaged. But also it's in this classroom. How are we going to create a good society in this classroom with this group of 20 people? What does that mean to create a good learning environment, a generous learning environment? So for me, it's always local and specific as well as kind of universal. And it's culturally defined and culturally shaped. And I think we have to stretch ourselves beyond humanity and think about multi-species, think about kind of how we engage with technology and the environment all the time. And I don't think we do that enough.
Yeah, I would completely agree, especially when we foresee what with technology will all be possible if we are not really going into dialogue there. But I'm just kind of trying to pin it a little bit more down. If you say this is something which is then context specific, local, do you engage maybe in a Habermasian dialogue, or is there any way where you try to go in a certain dialogue fashion in order to make sure that you share the good society in that classroom?
Well, I try and set up pedagogies which allow people to find their own voices. So I think pedagogy is very important, like how you structure a classroom. So I'm not some utopian, being part of an anarchist group was interesting because you realize how flawed the idea of leaderless organizations are. You realize how leaders would always kind of arise and how power would always be present. So I'm actually very clear that, sometimes I stand up and give a seminar and I take out what Lacan would call a master discourse. I'm someone who has knowledge and I've done a lot of studying and I bring something to this. I'm not afraid of standing up and doing that. I think it's important that people do. I think we need thinkers. I think we need thought leaders. So I think people have to stand up and share some expertise, some knowledge. And then at the same time, I get the group to self-manage their own learning, their own discourses, to dialogue with me. So I try and mimic in the classroom and in learning environments how this takes place. So it's dialogical, it's peer-led quite often. Sometimes it's kind of with vertical hierarchy, sometimes it's not. And that's the world we live in. And I think that's the world we have to navigate. And that's what I try and work with in my teaching work.
I want to, Simon, because it's somehow so essential, right? It goes to the core of who are we? Well, what's the future? And how can we as individuals have any sort of impact on the future? And I want to throw a few thoughts at you, if I may, and then just get your reaction on it. So one, in terms of individual happiness, you talk about happiness imperative. So clearly this notion that it's all about the individual happiness is not prevalent in your thinking. And I'm thinking about Freud, who suggested that the best we can achieve is a ordinary unhappiness, which I think goes back a little bit to your original point. And Melanie Klein talks about the fact that loss is implicit in love and annihilation, death, is implicit in life. So there's always seems to be at an individual level some sort of dichotomy, and the wounded versus the celebrated self. At a societal level, Schumacher, I think, famously suggested that our modern experiment to live without religion has failed. And in this context, again, I was very intrigued by your initial comments, Quaker versus Anglican Church, because he said they've almost lost this godness. So there's Václav Havel, who I think suggested mankind cannot really get to some good society without a supernatural lawgiver, without something that pulls us out of ourselves and allows us to transcend. So if I take all of this with your notion just now, the good society in this classroom, so there seems to be something about, on the one hand, we need to make sense of our own lives and the relationships that we have will make us grow. On the other hand, there seems to be a question of, is it the individual or is it the collective? And am I serving something? Is it the relations around me? Is it something greater? And there's a notion that if it's not something greater that is beyond all of us, it will actually never create the energy for all of us to create this ethos of interdependence and participation. So I realize these are all very complex thoughts and ideas, but this is really something that keeps us awake, so to speak, at night, because is there an answer in your mind? Or is it a dynamic puzzle where phronesis in the moment is what we have to aim for?
Well, I agree. I think secularism has failed. I think secularism, modernity, these things go hand in hand. I think it's kind of left a void and a gap, left an alienated self, left a fragmented self. And we see where that leads to, like mass depression, mass consumption. We try and fill that void in any way we can, So I think that, I don't think that kind of some patriarchal God or some mega God outside ourselves it doesn't make sense to me personally. I mean, I think we need to rediscover how to enchant the world, how to live enchanted lives. I think Weber's idea of the modernity being kind of a disenchanted is very, very important. And I've been thinking a lot about that for many, many years. And I think we need to find a spirit life, a soul life, an enchanted life. And I think we can find it. Again, I think it's culturally defined. It will be different in different, I was talking to First Nation people in Australia recently, and that's really interesting to a different worldview. Very, very important. But I think we have to re-enchantalize with the spirit world, and I will find that in a Benedictine monastery. I will find that in the mountains and the woods. I will find that through my children. I will find that in different, through relationships with others, with plants. I will find it in many ways. And the God idea is kind of a mystery which I don't ever think I will solve or anybody will solve. But it interests me, and I'm happy to kind of play with that idea. But when people kind of ask me to explain God, I have no answer.
But I think there's something at the bottom, Simon, which is this kind of individual versus community or relatedness. So relationship or relatedness, where I was intrigued because in your coaching, and we will come to that in the second part, you're looking at different lenses, and it's almost like every lens has something to offer. But I think ontologically speaking, there's a big difference between a notion that we somehow have a soul, and if we only think about it hard enough and maybe go into a cave, into some meditation and so on, we will find our essence. And I think there's a kind of the individuation journey that kind of Jung would prescribe to a degree is also quite self-centric, vis-a-vis a different notion of self. Someone like Puet, for example, is suggesting there is no essence or so that we need to search for in life. We are just a messy coherence of patterns that we've acquired. And it's all about becoming aware of these patterns, and whatever kind of sense is always relational, identity is relational, and so on. And to me, it seems that there's almost like a dichotomy. Maybe it's both, but is it searching for soul and essence kind of in the individual, or is it the relational aspects of we have to be compassionate with ourselves, but also with others, and ultimately happiness is what we do for others? Is there, what resonates more with you, or is it really both?
Well, it's both. I don't think you can. I think if you just go down the individual path and you become narcissistic, self-consumed, I think that's problematic. I also think it's problematic to kind of say there is no self. I think the Western ideas, when we kind of take on Eastern, Buddhist, Hindu ideas and appropriate them, people kind of use the language of from ego to eco, and it's all very kind of nice, but actually, we all have egos, and maybe I'm just undeveloped. Maybe I'm not. Maybe if I was born in India and encultured in a way which was Hindu, maybe I would understand this kind of much more dispersed self. But for me, my experience, from my personal experience, and Quakerism always says follow your personal experience. It's like I experience a soul. I experience a soulfulness, and I experience something. I only experience that when it's in relation to nature, to other things. It's never kind of just Simon's soul. It's always Simon in relation to something, to my losses, to my loves, to my pleasures, to my desires, to my hurt, to my sadness. It's always in relation. So it's very relational. But for me, it's it's the individual does have a kind of soulfulness, and I think that's why I started my coaching with the depth analysis, soul coaching. Let's start there and then go out to the other things which we'll explore later. But that might be because I'm just underdeveloped, or just a Western, I might be part of the Western society and I just can't shake that off. I'm not sure.
Okay, that of course also bears the question whether we should always kind of compare and say there is a higher development, but that's probably yet another topic to address here. I'm going to back to a little bit more mundane question, but it's also a very important one for our quest, and we have seen that you take care of that as well, and that is really more about the role of organizations in the sense, how would you look at social responsibility of a business? How does it place this business into society? And what is about the concept of the common good in that regard? Is that a helpful one?
Yeah, so in my theory of eco-leadership, I talk about one of the four qualities of eco-leadership is organizational belonging. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that organizations lost their sense of belonging. Not all of them, but particularly the big corporates and the international global organizations where they do offshore banking, and they become separated from society. So in the 18th century, there was big, powerful organizations, but they had some local base. They had a place, So the Cadbury factory in Birmingham, in the Quaker factory in Birmingham in the UK, they had a place and they built houses for local people. They still controlled people. They weren't kind of some utopian kind organization. They made a profit, mm-hmm. and they were successful, but they knew their place, mm-hmm. and they gave something back in that place. And I think that kind of connection to place, to people, has been severed and lost through neoliberalism, and I think it's hugely problematic. So organizations need to belong, and they need to belong to a place, and and that could also, the place can also be in the internet, in the global environment, with others. So we need to be connected to, the wider environmental questions, how we pollute the world, how we connect to others. So we have to belong to society. We have to belong to the environments in which we live. Organizations do, and that's kind of a huge kind of part of my work, is to reconnect organizations. I talk about organizations being ecosystems within ecosystems, and it seems to me that business schools and organizations lost that idea. And even though systemic thinkers, they still talk about organizations, in my mind, as closed systems, really. I think people still conceptually, they might have a different language, but they still think of organizations as closed systems. And I'm thinking that they're networks, and they're open systems, and they're fluid between society. There's not a kind of tight boundary between an organization and society. This is a much more fluid boundary.
But I think, again, this is really why Antoinette and I started this inquiry, because what came up for me was, I think what you're saying is close to what Carol Sanford is saying with nested ecosystems, and the necessity to kind of be able, through what she calls nodal interventions, to take the energy in the systems to a higher level. And she explains her theory. It will be very interesting in a few weeks. We talk to Ed Freeman about how that links to classical stakeholder theory in terms of the paradigm of multiple stakeholders. But what also I think what you say resonates with what Stefano Zamagni talks about in his notion of civil economy, because he comes from the Christian social thought. And he says the common good is one thing we have to aspire to. Another class of good is relational good, which is exactly, I think, what you describe in that also closeness to place. And the other aspect he brings in is gratuitousness. He talks about dono, which in Italian is really the ability to give something which is free and is not expecting any return. It's this notion of mutuality, but in a sense of agape, this love that I give without expectation to return, with the hope that it might be exchanged forward. I do something which then might trigger you to do something for someone else. And I think that is really, this notion of reciprocity and mutuality. And I wanted to ask a question here, and it's a little bit about taxonomy, so I apologize, but you say the principles for belonging are mutuality, solidarity, and engagement. Now, the Christian social thinking would suggest the key principles are solidarity, fraternity, and subsidiarity. And in the way that you define engagement, it actually sounded a lot to me like reciprocity, so the obligation to a neighbor, and mutuality and solidarity for me were very similar, and also similar to the concept of fraternity. So I just wonder, how do you, if you say belonging is critical, how do you define these notions of mutuality, solidarity, engagement, which sounded a little bit different to some of the other thinkers?
Well, to bring it, I think it's easier to bring it into an example. So I'm writing a book chapter at the moment on the health sector. And, you know, I know the health sector. I lived in the health sector for 30 years, you know, as a general nurse, psychiatric nurse manager. And it strikes me that these ideas aren't some sort of concepts which we play with. For me, the problem with the health sector is not just about funding or about making it more efficient or making it a kind of a, people talk about making it more compassionate. It's like, these are the wrong questions. The questions are, make it more mutual, build solidarity, because the problem with the health sector really is the fact that we have patients and doctors. We have dependent, we go in with a mindset, I'm dependent and you're the expert. And that gives away all my power, it gives away all my kind of responsibility. So in a mutual situation, mutuality, I've been working in a health sector for quite a while, bringing eco-leadership to it, trying to transform the factory, hospital, institution, the complex. You know, it's like people get sick, they get taken to kind of this great big building and people do things to them and then they get sent out the other end. It's like this idea has to kind of change. I mean, we have to realize that health and well-being are much more part of a network, and mutuality has to be part of that. So patients have to become patient citizens. They have to kind of belong in a way and take responsibility. And it's much more about public health, about diet, about kind of healthy living, about well-being, about mental health. All these things, we'll never get a proper health system unless we kind of have a mutual system. And has to be solidarity. So it's about breaking power boundaries, you know, and stopping this kind of top-down, you know, expert, doctor, nurse, patient kind of linear kind of idea. And we have to transform.
What you call, Simon, is that what you call a heteronormative parental structure?
Yeah, that's that. I mean, it's part of patriarchy. It's part of kind of the way things have been structured in modernity for many years. And it's you know, it's a factory model. It's a plantation model transferred. Now it's made a bit kinder and nicer now, but it's still the same model, and it still means that some are powerful and some are powerless. You know, as a nurse, I experienced being powerless in relation to doctors, and yet I knew so much more about the patients because I talked to them for 8 hours a day, where the doctor would walk into the ward and see them for 2 minutes. You know, there's a different. It's not to say that they didn't have a different expertise than me. But the power was completely wrong. There was not non-mutuality there, and because of that, there was no solidarity. You know, and when I was a family therapist, the only way I could work with a family was by building solidarity, mutuality with them, not by taking a higher position and kind of laying down the law of how they should parent or what changes should be made. It was a very different relationship, much more relational, much more mutual. That was the only way you could work it. And that has to transform all organizations. I mean, that's utopian. We won't ever get there, but we have to move towards it, to move towards that process, towards that understanding.
But what I'm also hearing, and maybe you can also explain that again in your words, is I'm hearing that you also, I mean, there are two sides. There's the system, but there is also this emancipatory thought, although you said you're slowly moving away from that in the sense that you assume that people also have to step into responsibility, into citizen roles. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's this idea, you know, we hear the idea of like empowering people. It's a very patronizing idea that I empower you, you know, Antoinette, I'm going to empower you, you know. It's like, sorry, Simon, you don't have the kind of power to empower me, you know. It's like this mutuality, this reciprocal kind of way of being is something we have to develop. And again, I'm really not a utopian. It's not like, you know, we can emancipate the world, you know. But understanding these relational kind of ways of being and these power dynamics will liberate us, you know, like millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds and millions of deaths take place because of the health system is organized in the way it is.
Yeah. So,
and maybe, Simon, what comes up for me is, I think you write somewhere that integrative theories, and I think many of them are somehow under this critical management science, lack a theory of power. And what I'm hearing a little bit is in order to change systems, you need to change power distribution. Otherwise, it's not really a change, I guess. Secondly, I think what you're suggesting is that if you're not aware of the power structures, then just elevating the discourse or the theory is not going to make any impact. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. And this is where critical theory has been helpful. I did learn from Foucault. I did learn from people about power being everywhere, and how power and discourse is, how knowledge and language is used to kind of keep people in different power relationships. So, that part of it is helpful. Humans do kind of use language, and language is important to understand. So power for me is absolutely essential to work with. And it's not, I often kind of go to work in organizations, and they always point to the bad boss, and they've got the power and we haven't, so therefore we can't do anything. And I'm like, get real, Get real, why are you giving them so much power? Don't give it away, don't give it away, I mean, think about it, kind of reflect on it. We're not quite so disempowered as we choose to be, or as the discourse tells us we are, or what we've got caught in, so it's really about kind of exploring those issues,
which I think moves us on to leadership and followership, and maybe also some of the projections. And I think you talk about leadership symptoms. So, but before we go there, because we had in this first section, which was Good Society, quite a number of thoughts. And I still think what I'm also taking an observer stance for a second is, I think there's still a lot to be thought of. I think these things are in evolution, and it's not easy answers. Otherwise, we probably would have found them. But maybe if we can just try for each, going around the table, to just grasp what were the 2 or 3 things that for people watching or for us were most important. I will try to kick it off. So I think we started with what is good. And I think what I'm hearing is we should bring in some of the magic, some of the all-backs. It's not just a normative stance. Here's a list of normative morality. This is good and bad. It's more about reconnection with others, but also with the wider system. And there's still some God somewhere in your thinking, but it's not certainly not a patriarchal God. It's something important. It's like an essence that gives meaning, maybe, or some. I'll leave that comment to you. I think then in terms of social responsibility, I think you're focusing almost again on this notion of, if people are located, if they're belonging to a place, to a group, to an ecosystem, you speak about ecosystems of ecosystems, then if they take accountability, and again, what struck me was this notion of caring, which I think is so prevalent in the healthcare sector. So this caring ethics, and Antoinette often speaks about the care ethics. Right? If we take care, which also was part of monastic tradition, right? Abikura is this notion of take care of the whole, yourself in the context of the whole, then responsibility will probably almost naturally flow from that. And then I think in terms of critical theory, you say you've moved a little bit away from that. There's a lot of just being contrarian, not having necessarily any options or solutions, which is unsatisfactory. And then secondly, again, I think you're going towards something that probably transcends, if I may call it, a purely cognitive analysis of the problem, towards something that is more holistic, and for you is probably also to do with how you feel about it. And again, interesting, we will talk about culture. You're describing that maybe it's not about how we do things around here, but how we feel about things that are around here. So that's what I'm kind of taking away. But Antoinette, I know you've taken more detailed notes. So maybe what were your thoughts? And then Simon, to close us off.
That could be a very wrong assumption. But I mean, and building on what you were just saying, I think what I really, really like is that you say, in order to kind of have us becoming something which is more related, we need this desire, we need this dream, we maybe also need a magic narrative. And we're all looking for that magic narrative. So that's certainly one thing which stuck with me. Then the other thing, I think you struggle the same way we are struggling with this I and we, or subsidiarity and solidarity. However we want to kind of place it, this is really, we want to have both. And of course, this is paradoxical thinking. And I think maybe if you look at the leadership symptoms, we can go a little bit closer there as well. But I find it hard not to crack, and I'm glad you find it a hard not to, let's put it this way. And then what I really, really cherish is that you not only say it's all about thinking. Of course, it's about understanding. Assuming responsibility means that you have to be able to see there is a discourse going on, or this is a worldview I'm in, and there are things beneath the surface. But indeed, I believe you need your heart as well. And I'm really looking forward when we go into the leadership to really go more into this emotional side as well. And here I believe you're one of the few, at least what I have read so far, they're all always very cognitive, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to sum up this. I was almost dreading this interview because I don't have the answers. I know I don't. You know, it's like I think I go to my deathbed and not have the answers. But I'm enjoying the journey, and you know, identifying good, identifying God. I wouldn't use your word magic. I think I live an enchanted life. Mm-hmm. You know, I've like I said, I've suffered a lot of grief. I've been through a lot of pain. That I've had many wonderful experiences. But there's an enchantment there which I hold on to, and if I lose that enchantment, I feel my soul shriveling. So I re-enchant my life. You know, I went to Poland in for August with my family, and I went to the mountains and to the forests and saw beaver, and it re-enchants me. Or I go to a Benedictine monastery for 3 days. It re-enchants. There's something about being close to enchanted people, things, environments, and manifesting that between myself and others. I get it in classrooms sometimes. I get it in different relationships. I get it at the local shop. When someone smiles at me, there's different ways, there's glimpses of God in the world around me, and that's how I experience it. And I think we have to enchant the world in that way. I think too many people are disenchanted and got lost in Netflix series and got lost in corporate worlds, and I think we have to kind of find a way to re-enchant that. Mutuality, reciprocal kind of ways of being, relational ways of being. These are really fundamentally important, and working beyond just humans into kind of multi-species thinking is also kind of really is part of what re-enchants the world for me.
Very nice, and thank you for sharing that. I think so. Re-enchant your life. I guess I talk a little bit more about your Lacanian discourse theory now going into the leadership world. And I think what came up for me whilst you're talking about enchantment, on the one hand, I'm wondering if that also could lead people astray, away from the relational aspect. If they search for, there are almost some of these mystic religious theories where it's all often about my essence and becoming me. And I think there's potentially selfish tension, which I again don't hear in how you describe it. The magic is always in relation to something. I think that's the point I'm taking away. Yeah. And I wonder, Simon, final question, maybe if I may, a bit facetious, but you always say that the desire, so your desire for re-enchanting your life in a Lacanian thing is based on lack, on the lack of something. So what does this tell you about yourself?
Well, it tells me that I'm always lacking something, and you know, it's like in this discussion, I'm lacking the words I'd like to find to kind of nail this. You know, I'm never quite there. You know, I never. You know, there's always something missing. It's like I can't quite get it. You know, and I've learned that actually that doesn't kind of depress me or leave me feeling empty. It leads to more desire to be more curious, to find out the next thing. And when I got my first master's degree, having not been educated before, is a massive thing, And then I still felt lack, so I did another master's degree just to make sure that the first one wasn't a fraud, And then you do a PhD, and you realise that you can write 3 books, 5 books, 10, Manfred Ketzeries, I think he's written 100 books or something, But there's no end to it. There's always a lack. If you're at 100, you want to write 200. So it's really making sense of the world, but using lack as a way not to kind of feel empty or just fill it with what Lacan calls an object pétillard, something to cover the lack. A lot of people just in this world cover the lack, with a Netflix series, with a bar of chocolate, with a new car, with we consume to cover the lack. And for me, it's not about covering the lack. It's about experiencing the lack and experiencing what desire comes from that. So what do I really want to write next? What do I really want? Not just to write a book to kind of tick another box, but what do I really want? I haven't written a book since my last one because I haven't really kind of got that desire, but I can feel it coming now. It's exciting when it comes. But you only get there if you hold on to the lack. If you don't try and, if I covered it up by writing a quick book to follow up the last one, I wouldn't, write the one I really want to write.
And I think the lack, and let's go to leadership, because I think being aware of that lack, but there's also something that I took from Alfred Adler when he said, if you're not really sure what the sense of your life or the meaning of your life is, do something for others. So I think there's also something about the giving. So if the lack leads you to give something because you're giving yourself into this conversation and we are creating something new together, because there's authenticity in the conversation. And I think that is also something which the lack won't go away, but it might produce good or bad effects. And I think what you just said, not being aware of that lack, talking about leadership, and maybe let's start off there. There's often a lot of projection, and you're talking about splitting, right? Splitting the good things, the good object in the kind of Tavistock theory, or I think the Kleinian relational theory is that the leadership becomes the good object, and then management becomes the bad object. And you say the good object leadership becomes a holy grail, or the golden chalice. So could you take us a little bit, a step back? And I want to give another core point that I took from your first book, which I want to really strongly recommend, not because you're here, because it has opened my eyes on some of these things. You talk about leadership as being a psychosocial influencing dynamic. So maybe if you could start us off there. So what is leadership and what's the problem with leadership? And from there, if you explain maybe what's a discourse, because I think many people will not have read Foucault or any of the discourse theory. So what's a discourse? And then if we can make our way to your 4 discourses of leadership, and then whenever you get us to a point where you feel we've got a common ground, then we have a few questions on those discourses, if that's okay.
Yeah, so let's start. I mean, leadership is problematic because it became very popular in the 1990s. If you go to one of these Google Ngram graphs and you put in leadership or transformational leadership, you see it sort of going along here to kind of 1980s, then it goes whoosh up at 1990s. It becomes like hugely kind of popular. People stop talking about management. They all talked about leadership, and I felt a bit ashamed because I just sort of jumped on that bandwagon, sort of. But it did interest me. I was like my thesis, my PhD thesis was to question that. Why is it kind of suddenly gone crazy? What is the meaning of leadership? And the phrase I used, the psychosocial influencing dynamic, was really to kind of say it's not just a charismatic person, it's not just a hero figure. It's people kind of use a lot of language, but I tried to capture it in this unwieldy sentence. But it means it's psychological. It's a social construct. It's something we socially construct between ourselves. It's kind of an idea. It's a psychological construct, and it's very much to do with influencing. Leadership's about influencing and influencing a dynamic between peoples. So something happens. You can't have leadership without followership. You can't have leadership without others, so it's how we kind of construct the idea of influencing really in society.
And if we build on the discourses, so first question is, what's a discourse? Is it just a chat we're having? Is this a discourse? And of course, that's a bit of how do you call it? Like a question that is not a question. And then secondly, what are the 4 discourses that you have analyzed based on your historical analysis?
Okay, so discourse. Discourse is a chat. Discourse is a word which is used in many different ways. So there's different ways of using the terminology, and it can mean different things. So the way I use discourse, and from a kind of Foucauldian way is that it's about the normative ways of being. It's about what we think of as normative. So if you go into a canteen in a workplace and people are, 10 executives are around the table and they're talking about leadership, they talk as if they all know what leadership is. There's a normative kind of thing, and what they're usually talking about. If you go into a room and say, okay, name me your favorite leaders, you'll get this idea. You'll get Gandhi, you'll get Martin Luther King, you'll get these charismatic leaders thrown out. And the normative discourse is a heroic, charismatic way of thinking. People just kind of assume that that's what we're talking about. So when you do a discourse analysis like I did, it was to deconstruct that. It was to challenge that. It was trying to understand how people thought about leadership over the last 100 years. And that's how I came up with the 4 discourses. So what was the normative way leadership was thought about, the dominant ways in the last 100 years? And I read all the literature, or not all the literature, but I read a good lot of the literature. I spent a year just being immersed in leadership literature, and I came up with these 4 discourses. So the first discourse was at the turn of the century, and it was the controller leadership discourse. And this was where scientific rationalism got brought into the organizational workplace. Taylorism was the biggest kind of name in it. He was known for the efficiency craze, and it was about applying science to workplace to make it more efficient. And this was the project of modernity. And of course, it was hugely successful. The Fordist production lines, mass production happened. The Soviets, Stalin and Lenin took it on as a way of transforming, modernizing Russia. Hitler was quite fond of it. We see it actually in the death camps as well. The efficient way of killing. This whole way of thinking was used to modernize society and to make the workplace more efficient. So you had time and motion studies, you had division of labor, and you got mass production and mass consumption from this process. And the kind of thinking behind it, the discourse behind it was, if you're running an organization, if you're running an industry, make it as efficient and apply science to that project. And of course, it was hugely successful. And the shadow side, the problem side, was hugely dehumanizing. But that discourse, all these discourses, they stay with us. That's still a part of what we do now. It's a growing discourse again. It went into some demise because it was so dehumanizing, but it's coming back through big data, through algorithmic management, through target control, through audit control. We see controller leadership on the rise again, and big question marks and big kind of concerns about kind of how dehumanizing this new form of technological controller leadership can be. So in the factory, it was all about a supervisor controlling you, looking very closely at what you did, working to the clock, clocking in, clocking out. Now it's surveillance capitalism. You're being watched, you're being surveyed, you're being set targets. It's all about your performance. It's about your KPIs. So we see it again. So the controller discourse was the first discourse. The second discourse.
Simon, can I throw in one question quickly? Because I know you talk about gig economy in the context of the eco-leadership discourse in a second, but isn't there a risk that also the gig economy becomes just a large-scale controller discourse? Because fragmentation, a market for individual skills and labor, is that not, I know you use it in a different context, but is there not a risk that they get merged almost, that the dominant paradigm integrates some of the others?
Yeah. I mean, I talk about that when I come to eco-leadership, but yeah, I mean, there's when I first started to write about these discourses, I thought that controller leadership and eco-leadership were two poles apart, the biggest opposites, and actually in contemporary society, they've become quite close again. So I definitely talk about the relationship between the two. And an important thing to say is that these discourses don't stand alone. So they merge, that they're at play with each other. They're in relation to each other in organizations, you know, so we'll explore a bit of that when I get to eco-leadership.
Can I also kind of just throw in something, and then I leave you because we want to hear your different discourses. But I was also wondering, I mean, now you developed it nicely that you had also this large literature analysis, but I understood that you also looked at what are the discourses in companies right now. So it's also an empirical project. And in that, I find it even more interesting because I find it worrying from my perspective that this controller discourse is coming back. So if you can throw in a little bit also of your empirical knowledge, that would be also very interesting.
Yeah, so I did the literature work, and I drew on my own experience of working in the life experience I told you about the hospitals and the factory. You know, when I worked in controller discourse, it was unbelievable. When I worked in a paper bag factory at the age of 16, the noise of the machines and the way you were tied to the machines and how you had to be machinic. You know, you didn't bring your emotions to work or your passion to work. You brought your body to work. It was manual labor. And it was like noisy, and it was dirty, and it was violent, and it was like, you know, there's a kind of a dehumanizing violence to that work, which I personally experienced now. And you also see it in the health sector. You see it in hospitals, how patients sometimes get treated kind of in a machinic way, you know, and people are kind of being moved around for efficiency reasons, you know, to hit kind of patient number targets rather than for humane reasons. You see it everywhere. It's kind of present everywhere. And just to say, it's not just a negative thing. We actually need controller leadership. You know, we do need to control resources. We do need to kind of have numbers. We do need to have some efficiencies in organizations, or they wouldn't work. You know, so it's about balancing this and using these in different ways. And this is how the discourses sort of come together. So I try and bring some of my experience in as I go through the discourses. The second discourse came about in the post-war era, and it became dominant in the kind of late 1960s, early 1970s. This is the therapist discourse. And this was a big shift from controlling workers to motivating workers. It was a big shift from thinking about how we can bring psychology into the workplace rather than just science. And it was about how you really focused on team motivation and individual motivation. And there's a whole array, like the Tavistock Institute, the Human Relations Movement, the Human Potential Movement. I'm talking to someone who knows this very well, and Antoinette, it's like your work. But, you know, HR, the human kind of resources were first personnel departments, you know, so they were kind of a part of this movement. And it's people kind of, it was driven by two things. One was to democratize society after the Second World War. People were very fearful of going back to the dictatorship of kind of Stalinism or Hitler. Is a kind of big concern for people. How do we avoid that? So how can we democratize society and democratize the workplace? And it's a very conscious project to try and do that. So these, you know, the Tavistock Institute and other organizations were brought in to try and put people first and give people, motivate people rather than just kind of control them and turn them into robots and machines so that they would rebel against the system. That there's kind of a big concern. You know, and this became a massive discourse in the 1960s. The countercultural kind of 1968 revolutions focused on individualism, on anti-authority, on changing from the society of command of prohibition to the society of commanded enjoyment. So people were searching for happiness, for searching for pleasure, for searching for self-satisfaction. There's the idea that you should be emotive and expressive rather than kind of having a stiff upper lip and keeping your emotions to yourself. So there's this big flip in society in the West, and this entered the workplace as well. So people came to work on themselves. You know, when I worked in a factory, I came to work to earn money, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience. now I hope to come to work to do some self-growth, to kind of because I'm motivated, because it kind of, I get some pleasure from it, you know. So people want careers and jobs which actually give them some self-growth and some pleasurable kind of way of being. So the therapist discourse is all about this. It's about motivating employees. A happy worker is a more productive worker. You know, it's not just altruistic. You know, we think if people come to work and they bring their whole selves to the work, they give more to the organization as well, and we're more likely to make profit. So there's that side to it. But that discourse is very strong. We see it in HR, we see it in leadership development, we see it in organizations where they put people first, where they realize that, you know, that people are their most important asset. Mm-hmm. So that's where we see the therapist discourse. And you know, I see it in coaching communities, and it's got its own language and its own discourse, and you can really see it. You see it. It's funny in business schools where they, 1 minute they're teaching controller leadership, they're teaching efficiencies, and they're doing that module, and then they flip into kind of the soft stuff, and they bring in someone like me to do some soft coaching skills or something. And it's quite amusing to watch them flip between these discourses.
And exactly with this wording, the soft stuff, yeah.
Yeah, but I think on this point, and moving to the next one now, but I think on this point, Stefano Zamagni was talking about the necessity for an axiological requalification, and axiology being about ethics and aesthetics. What's the value? And I think you are criticizing many of the coaching schools as being performance coaching. So you're trying to help people to qualify, but it's always about to act more efficiently and productively within the system, and very often what people are working on is not even what they want to work on, but what their bosses or their organizations have suggested are the weaknesses that come out of the 360 feedbacks that people should improve to become more, better able to serve the machine still.
That's right, and this is where these discourses are not separate. So you get a performative coaching body or an HR team, and they're totally target focused, and they're audit focused, and they're performance KPI focused, and how you're going to measure the success. You know, I coach Otti, and I got to see if his performance goes up 30%, and how do I measure that? So you're really combining therapist kind of discourse with controller discourse there. Like they get kind of enmeshed, and people flip between them, and they use the language. And 1 minute we must be more compassionate, and next minute they're hitting targets, and it's once you. I mean, I find these discourses. What I say is these discourses aren't, they're not perfect. They're not the only way to describe an organization or leadership, but they're quite helpful. They're quite helpful to kind of see where these discourses clash, to see where the clashes take place, and how you slip from one to the other. And you can see how they can be useful together if you can use them in a healthy way. So the second was this therapist discourse. Now, it's very strong and remains strong. It still remains with us today. You know, coaching, emotional intelligence, it's kind
positive psychology probably as well. Just kind of before, sorry, we're always interrupting you because I just found it interesting. That means the overarching rationale is still, we're still, how Karen Lecke always said, slave to power. So, I mean, in the end, it's all about productivity. It's a happy worker, it's a productive worker. But I'm just kind of looking at that from the outside now. There is, of course, a fundamental difference, but in the end, productivity and not some ethical inspiration, for instance, seems to be still prevalent.
I don't think they're binary, and this is where I do have problems with like critical management theory. Is they'll pick a hole in it and say it's just it's all about productivity in the end. And it's like, well, yeah, if I go to hospital, I do actually want to kind of be made healthy. I don't, because they're a wonderful ethical organization. But, my grand died, they're very nice, but, she died because they didn't have time to do the operation, It's, organizations do have to perform. They do have to kind of be successful, do have to be productive, So it's not kind of this or that. It's about, this is what is contested. There's no perfect, but these, if you have an ethical organization, you actually still want it to be fairly efficient. You still want your children to be educated. You still want, your car to work. When you get in an airplane, you want it to fly properly. You want some controller lead to do the safety work on it. So, these things are entangled. They're entangled, and it's about being able to see and discuss. If we're going too far into control leadership where it becomes dehumanizing, I've got a serious problem with that. If you're manipulating, I see therapist language being used in a very manipulative way. People talk about, I'm shocked, to be honest. I'm still shocked now. I go into management kind of leadership circles, and people talk about we must change their behaviors. And for me, I almost feel physically sick, because behavior change for me takes me back to the psychiatric hospital, where we use token economy, where if you got out of bed, you got 3 cigarettes. If you stayed in bed, you weren't allowed to smoke, and these sort of behaviorist kind of ways. And actually what they do in the workplace, they use the same language in the same way, coach so-and-so to change these 3 behaviors. So they hit this competency chart, and it's like, what are they, circus animals, or are they people, And it's quite shocking that we don't kind of see what we're doing, and we still treat people like that. It's kind of disturbs me to the as you can hear in my voice. So it's about being able to kind of ask questions about it, and making sure that the ethics are there alongside productivity and efficiencies. So the next discourse came along in the late 1980s, and one thing I say about this discourse as well, what shocked me when I read the literature was how much of the literature just talked about organizations as closed systems and didn't think about the relationship to society and what was going on outside organizations. So the therapist discourse, as I said, that really came from the idea of democratizing society. In the Second World War, the control of discourse was used, science and rationalism was used to create death camps in one of the most civilized parts of Europe, next to one of the oldest universities in Europe. The death camp existed, and it really challenged the idea that science was a civilizing project. People thought that if you applied science to the world, and you could civilize human nature, you could civilize the wildness of the environment, and you could tame human nature and civilize it, And the Second World War kind of just threw that into disarray. It made a mockery of it. Applying scientific ideas could be done in an evil way. You can create the atom bomb, Hiroshima. You could destroy the whole planet. So suddenly this big question about science being, people having faith in science as a good thing, was questioned. And then people realized, that subjectivity, our emotions, society, being human, bringing ethics into it, were really important as well. You couldn't just kind of apply science as if that was going to do the job of civilizing humanity. So these outside forces change the way people take up leadership, and the way economic changes, technological changes also force changes in organizational leadership kind of ways of thinking. And in the 1980s, that economic change of a big slump in the West really challenged our way of thinking. It's like, we had the best business schools in America. We had kind of all the knowledge here. We had the greatest car factories. And then suddenly the Asian tiger economies, Toyota, were kind of outperforming the American economies. And it was like a big shock to the ego and to the system. How on earth are they doing this? How can these kind of like small countries over there kind of be outperforming us? And so they sent off their consultants and their researchers to Asia to kind of try and make some sense of this. And what they came back with, the stories they came back with, was actually they thought the leverage and the advantage they had over in the Asian economies was collectivism. So they had strong cultures, and people used to go to work, they'd sing, they wear the same uniforms, they'd sing the company, they'd raise a company flag, and they'd sing the company song, they'd eat in shared canteens. There wouldn't be kind of a chief executive officer at the top of the building that they'd eat in the same canteen as the workers. There's an idea of cradle to grave kind of being looked after by the company. It's just much more of a collective society, and the companies managed to leverage that collective society in the workplace. So you've got your quality circles. You got workers sitting around together talking about how they can make improvements in their part of the business. You're engaging workers not as kind of part of the machine on a production line, just kind of being bored and doing a job. You're asking them, how can you make improvements? And you're engaging them in a more collective way. And that they thought was giving the Asian economies the advantages they were getting. And they tried to take that idea to the West. But the question was, how do you create an individualistic society like America? How could you create a collective society? It just doesn't kind of work out. And I mean, in my book, I go into great depth about this around the Christian kind of fundamentalists and stuff. But to make a shortcut here, basically what they did was get the idea of transformational leaders. So a Messiah leader, I call this a Messiah discourse. A Messiah leader would set out a vision, and people in the company would follow that vision, and they try and create a strong culture. So we get the idea of, from Kunda, of engineering culture. You know, we start seeing culture being used as a word in the leadership and management literature in the late 1980s. It wasn't used before. Suddenly it was a dominant word. How can you change the culture? How can you create a strong culture? And the idea was, if you've got a strong culture, then you've got peer surveillance, you've got culture control, you've got self-surveillance. You came to work and you gave your whole self to work because you believed in the leader, or you believed in the project. You know, you worked for Apple and Steve Jobs said you were going to be the greatest company in the world, you're going to make the greatest products in the world, and you believed, and it might be painful, but you worked 12, 14, 15-hour days because not because you were told to, but because everyone did, the peers did, you know, and it was part of the culture control. So the idea of creating a company which had a family feel to it, have a community feel to it, all this language was around trying to create this collectivism, which brought people together to work hard together to kind of deliver. So Messiah leadership was about not just some hero on a white horse as the old heroic leaders. It's about creating strong cultures which created these collective environments. And of course, the flip side of that is you get culture control, which creates totalizing environments and conformist environments. You know, so you either I worked in companies like this. I worked in a company. I consulted to a company in the US. I won't name the company, but it was a fashion company, and it grew from kind of being a successful company in the US to kind of a global company. And the chief executive used to say, like, you're either with us or against us. You've got this. You've got a design mentality, or you haven't. And he basically recruited everybody in his own likeness. And it created a conformist culture, and it almost collapsed because of that. And in the end, they had to get rid of the chief executive and get somebody else to run the company because it became such a cult. But you've got language in the literature around, you know, Peterson, Waterman, and other Porras were writing about cult-like cultures. You needed companies to have cult-like cultures so that they could actually deliver with passion, and that would kind of be successful. How much of this was actually rhetoric and how much of it is true is debatable. But what we do know is that chief executive salaries in the 1980s kind of just went from like 40 times the normal salary to kind of 400, 500 times, you know. And even now that these Messiah leaders get massive salaries now. So that was the third discourse, the Messiah discourse.
We even have an own branch in HR and called it superstar management. So in that sense, yeah, which is very sad, watching the language.
Yeah.
And I think, so I know we are starting to run short on time. So Simon, please tell us if you have to go at some stage, and then I will shorten it. But I think there are still some topics that we wanted to go through. And one is eco-leadership. The second, I think, is societal leadership development, and on the basis of that and your own coaching methodology, how do we develop better leaders? We wanted to take a glimpse at social change, because I know that you're talking about Greta shortly. So we just wanted to get a quick glimpse at your thoughts, and you're writing about Lenin, which I think very few people have done. And of course, you have a chapter on what do you call the automist, leadership in your book. So there's something about revolution which we wanted to test. And then finally, we wanted to take a glimpse briefly at what does it mean for organizations. So these are the topics on our backlog still. But I think if we could maybe then just quickly, so we've talked about controller, about therapist, about the Messiah leadership discourse. And I would say the connotation with fundamentalism, and I love your points on the new Protestant work ethic, which I think, again, the late Brian Ungert, a good friend of ours, always said the dominant paradigm has that nasty habit of incorporating all of the other paradigms. And I think almost this Protestant work ethic, which was at the basis of some of Weber's thinking, what you describe with fundamentalism and the neoliberal thought developing this new Protestant work ethic, it almost resonates with this Church of Capitalism. And lots of people have written about the religion of capitalism. It creates its own system and paradigms and rituals and kind of saints. And I think it's very, very interesting, this whole context. But if anything comes up for you, let's bring that in, and then let's maybe go to the eco-leadership paradigm, which is really your new thought on how it could evolve. And then from there, let's see how many of the other backlog topics we can still have a look at. But so religion and capitalism, any thoughts before we go to eco-leadership?
Well, it's very interesting that the religion and capitalism, like secularism, is the fastest growing religion. So maybe in that void, capitalism, I think, becomes a religion. I think that's what's happened. That the void of even in the States, which has still got a high Christian kind of engagement, it's still the next generation is still leaving the church in great numbers. So
yeah, but what caught me, Simon, if I can chip in, was this: you described the notion of almost the Church of Capitalism is based on the notion of freedom, and especially negative freedom, right? So this notion that it's all about individual freedom, and that is pervasive in the current discourse, right? Even Rawls' theory of justice and how we build systems and institutions is always based on this individualistic notion of freedom. And I think what you're describing when you talk about fundamentalist evangelism, if that's the right word, is kind of this: it is still based on the only religion is individual freedom, but we are and this notion of the individual has access to Christ, basically, but we're creating a collective church where we're all cherishing the notion of individual freedom. It's kind of almost a dichotomy that it is being bridged in a very fetish kind of way. But
yeah, I mean, in the book I write about how fundamentalist churches just learned directly from capitalism, and capitalism learned directly from fundamentalist churches, so that they were isomorphic. They kind of imported each other's ideas, and it just becomes like an amalgam of kind of one thing in the end. And it's like this is like the freedom, the language of freedom, of individuality, of faith, and you can see how this transfers onto a Messiah leader very quickly, in the workplace. It's these are it's interesting that the evangelical fundamentalists of the church were quietists. In fact, they used to be kind of Southern Baptists who lived in the South quietly, and no one paid much attention to them. And New York and Washington were the big cities. And then suddenly they went for a takeover bid. They started to market themselves. They got televangelists. They broke out from their kind of small circles. Phenomenal story. They got Reagan elected. They kind of they took power, and they used all the mechanisms and all the thinking of the capitalist system very cleverly. And then in the capitalist system took those ideas of collectivism and conformity into the workplace. So it kind of reinforces Messiah leadership job. So it is, it fascinated me.
Absolutely. And I think Antoinette and I, we will come to that in a second when we talk about relational model and organizational models. And we're looking for this hybrid, which in a positive way brings the individual and the community and the collective and the relatedness together. But it's very difficult. And I think Stefano Zamagni talks about corporations. And he says it's almost like the flight of the bumblebee. It's by physical law not possible. At one step in the market economy and the capitalistic society, because you have to be efficient and make some profit. On the other hand, you want to nourish the community and be part of the kind of the ethical good society. And it's a very difficult dynamism that you have to put in place in order for this to work. And I think what we're seeing with the fundamental church and also with the capitalism that you described with Messiah leadership is actually that is a non-nourishing dynamic, because there's actually, I think you say, conflict is obliterated, right? So it's actually really pushing this conformist mindset. And I think in your book, you say kind of the worst at some stages, people are not even questioning that anymore. They become happy slaves in that system.
Yeah. And you know, this is what frightens me when I go into corporations now, and it flips me back to the totalizing asylum I used to work in. And you know, I go into a corporate bank, and I actually feel a little bit sick because, you know, bodily, I get a physical reaction to it because it reminds me of being in the asylum. And it reminds me of, like, you know, everyone's wearing black suits, everyone's talking the same rhetoric. It's like, you know, any dissent is hidden and suppressed. And people do perform the happiness imperative, and they become, I mean, Catherine Casey writes very well about this. They become subjugated. They become capitulated selves. They don't have the capacity to critique him anymore. They're just part of this kind of bigger world, you know. And they don't see their own conformity. And it's exactly like being in a fundamentalist church, you know. Because if you critique it, you're out. It doesn't work. You know, you kind of a fundamentalist church means kind of like you follow the Messiah leader, you follow the discourse, and you don't step aside. There's a collectivism about it. There's a feeling of being part of something. That, you know, you get some positives, but you lose your sense of kind of self and critique and autonomy. And in the end, it's a dangerous place to be.
Okay, so I fully agree. And eco-leadership, then, the final discourse that you see emerging, but you're also constructing. So what are the key parts of that?
So I saw it emerging in the first book, 2008. I saw kind of the prefix eco being used around, and networks and ecosystems, and it was just a start. You know, Margaret Wheatley's book and Capri, and these people were starting being brought into management thinking a little bit on the edges. And I sort of noticed this, and I made a note of it as an emerging discourse. And then I decided to do some work on it because it seemed to me that it's very, very important to kind of have a new discourse of leadership. So I developed the theory and practice of eco-leadership, and I not developed it, I'm developing it. It's an emergent practice, and it's kind of not just me, it's lots of other people. And this is why I'm forming the Eco-Leadership Institute, kind of to work with others, to collaborate with others, to keep this moving forward. And the idea is that firstly, we think about organizations as ecosystems within ecosystems. So they're not closed systems to be made more efficient or to kind of just be productive. They're part of wider society, part of the environment, and engage in wider societal, technological, and environmental kind of ecosystems. They're just part of it, as we as humans are part of nature and part of the ecosystems. The three kind of key ideas I'm working with at the moment are that, one, it should be an ethical kind of project, that social purpose should be brought into all organizations. So it's not just kind of about growth and about profit. Kind of the purpose, like what shared value are you creating in your organization? And that's interesting that became from a marginal idea to kind of is now quite a mainstream idea, although it's not practiced quite as fully as it should be. So a lot of work to be done there, but it's actually become a mainstream idea. The second part of it is that these organizations should be more participative. So it's about really trying to shift that barrier between hierarchy and between leadership and followers. Position, power, leadership and followership are changeable, and we should work with that idea. We should distribute leadership more throughout the organization so that an organization become more adaptive, so that people can become more engaged themselves, individually, as teams, as collective bodies, and really the becomes alive again through being more participative, through people not just being dependent actors or robots in a machine, that they actually bring themselves to work, and they bring what leadership qualities they have, and everybody has some leadership qualities and followership qualities. And the third part is eco mindset. So it's social purpose, participative organizations, and eco mindset. And the third part is the most difficult, I think. I think the third part, to shift our idea from machine metaphor to ecosystem metaphor, from a modernist way of thinking into kind of a different way of thinking, post and pre-modern way of thinking, is the most hard thing. And that's the thing I'm struggling with mostly, with delivering this in the workplace. People conceptually get the ideas, but in practice, they just flip back over and over again to a controller, therapist, and messiah leadership. And just to say, eco-leadership is not about saying, okay, those ways of leading and working in organizations are 20th century, and this is the new way. Eco-leadership is about internally inside an organization using controller leadership appropriately, about having enough therapist leadership to make sure that it's a humanistic organization, to make sure you have vision, structural ideas are important. It's about getting them in balance in any part of the organization and in the whole organization. So some organizations will need more therapist leadership, some will need more controller leadership, some will need to revisit the vision and the social purpose and develop a strong culture that they can form around. It's not, eco-leadership inside the organization is about balancing the four discourses. Outside the organization, it's about connecting to the wider ecosystems.
And I apologize, there have been a few technical challenges. Antoinette, sorry, that something went wrong with the Wi-Fi. I think most of the thoughts came through okay, but otherwise we will correct them in the transcript. And I just wanted to throw in one thought, which was, I think on our backlog, Simon, this would be a follow-up conversation. I think you're describing a balancing of discourses, where someone like Brian Ungert, the Chief Purpose Officer of the Decurion, and the conversations we had in Precedence would say, the balancing is actually what is the problem. You need to have one coherent discourse, otherwise you always get this notion of falling back into the wrong one, and it's just a symptom of the target one, so to speak, not being strong enough. I think this is something which would be great to explore together a little bit further. But Antoinette, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, of course, also then hangs together whether we see that as paradoxes or not. I think that's a huge batch to take apart. But what cried out almost to me, certainly since we had this discussion also about the Messiah, is your idea then is to develop leadership in everybody. So first of all, I'm then not so sure how the people coming to you, is this everybody? So that would be maybe a separate thing to discuss. Hence, I'm interested, how can you develop these qualities? So do you work also with developmental psychology? And even more so, because it happens to be coincidence that tomorrow we talk with Bill Torbert, when I look at these stages models, they don't look like your type of leadership. They, to me, look much more power vested, although, of course, it is about sharing. But if I look at the tasks, if I look at the structures, it's still much more in this idea. So also a situation of your approach towards these Torbert, Keegan approaches, for instance, would be very interesting.
I'm not sure where to begin. I mean,
that was a big question as well.
Yeah. When you say, how do I develop these leaders, you immediately go back to an individualistic kind of model then. And so I try and disrupt that in my thinking. In my books, I write about leadership formation, and I borrow from the monastic tradition. So I'd say that, if you go to a monastery, you don't train a monk in monk skills. A monk becomes formed by the habitat around them. They get formed by the whole community. They get formed by the prayer life, by the rituals, by the practices, by their experience of living. And I guess, we've talked a lot about my own experience and what I draw on. I've been formed as a leader. I've been formed through my experiences. I think we all are. I think it's a mistake to think that, that we can go away and develop people kind of individually. So I think there's a huge amount of money being wasted on leadership development in the past few years. And when I talk about leadership formation, I think about individuals, teams, and whole organizations and beyond. So, you don't kind of just pick off the high potential leaders and take them on a course and train them to be eco-leaders. You actually create formation processes where leadership can emerge. So I don't think everybody can be charismatic leaders. I don't think everyone can be kind of expert leaders in technical leaders, but I think everyone has leadership capacity, and it's unique and it's individualistic. Again, like in the monastery, every monk has a charism. They might not be sure what that charism is. They have to discover it. It will be emerging. It will come from us. But you have to create spaces for this charism to emerge in the individual and in the monastery.
Simon, the charisms or the charisma, Zamani is also talking about it, if I understood it correctly, is always in relation to the community. It's not the same as charisma, so to speak, in the way that we use it today, which is more an individual, almost character trait. Whereas the charism of someone like Saint Benedict or Francis was more about their gift, almost like a divine gift to bring to the community, correct?
Yeah, well, each monastery and each tradition has its own charism. So the Franciscans' charism will be different to the Benedictines' charism, and every individual has their own charism within that. So it's you choose which monastery you go to depending on the charism of the monastery. You choose which organization you work in depending on kind of your identification to their social purpose or your career. But within these organizations, at the moment, there's a lot of repression, there's a lot of subjugation, there's a lot of dependency activity. You know, when we choose the top 50 high potentials, it means that the other kind of 700 are low potentials. It's not very good way to think, is it? You know, so, but I think about it, I always say there's no personal development without organizational development. You know, even if I'm doing one-to-one coaching, I'm still thinking about the whole organization, the whole system. So it's about making that relational link all the time. And when you're designing an organization to create an eco-leadership culture, you're trying to create a culture which enables leadership to emerge rather than...
I think those almost... I mean, we are very fascinated by virtue ethics. And I think in the Aristotelian way of flourishing, this development in and with the community, I think, is one of the thoughts that at least many thinkers like McIntyre associated with that. And I think you are building on the character of leaders, stepping into these discourses in a very aware fashion, also into that tradition. But I think what you're saying about what struck me with the formation of the monks, it's an experiential learning. And I think Antoinette spoke about this at some stage, that with monks, it's not as simple as a recruitment process in a modern corporation. You actually go on a formation journey for multiple years before you and the other monks agree that this is your path, so to speak, which again, I think is very interesting, right? It's a completely different concept than looking at a human being as a set of skills and then choosing them based on what skills are inherent in the role that we're looking for. No, it's actually like a mutual contract for collective elevation and development, right? It's again something you might be able to learn.
And and you say it's completely different, and it is, but I think they need to come closer together. I think organizations can learn from that idea rather than the modernist mindset. Okay, we get Otti because he's got these skills, he's got these competencies, he fits into this role. This is all the divided way of thinking. If you look at the holistic, how does that kind of, what can that person bring to us? What's emergent capacity do they have to kind of offer to the whole, then it's a different discussion.
But I think here, this is and now let's go to the social change maybe quickly and then to organization to finish off. But I think, Simon, one thing that struck me going back to the beginning of our conversation is, in order to do that, you almost need to step into faith. You almost need to step into faith that there is something which transcends the notion of efficiency and power, that there's something which is beauty and kind of something that we can develop together. Might take longer, might have up and downs, but there's a commitment to a common future. And I think in this narrative of neoliberal capitalism, that commitment also, that maybe that even that willingness to sacrifice is not there. And one of the things Antoinette and I are looking at, and we have different opinions on this notion of sacrifice, but actually some of the worldviews are also differentiated by what suffering means in that worldview. And I find it fascinating. So again, to your point, if we need a new worldview that allows this formation to happen, we might need to think very carefully about what kind of worldview would allow us to do that. What is the vision? What is the attractor that we can build?
Absolutely, and you know, one of the big shifts is that as the environmental crisis is that even 5 years ago, it felt like it was quite a long way away, and we could push it away. And now we have fires burning in California, we have droughts. I think there is a new awakening which is opening up a space for this.
Yeah, but you cannot build that vision of hope on fear, I would suggest.
No, which is why I don't join some of the doomsayers, and you know, I don't think that's I think driving the fear message is not, you know, I think maybe we should be afraid, but I don't think it's kind of the way forward. You know, is why I'm trying to offer a kind of purposeful way of engaging people, because I think you have to build that kind of that hope and that aesthetic and that new way of being and through love and virtue and stuff. I think that and faith. I think that's kind of the way forward. But I do think kind of people's mind do get opened by crisis, by COVID. I think these can be openings for people. So I think there is like ways open. You don't drive it through fear, but fear or anxiety can open something up, and then you try and offer something else, I think.
Which brings us straight to social change. So Antoinette, we had a few questions to throw in there very quickly, I guess. Oh, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think you were most interested in, and that's not the question I'm going to ask about, this fascinating story of Trotsky and Lenin. So maybe you want to ask that one. Because mine were almost already answered. I mean, I'm still very interested about this macro and micro emancipation, but particularly because you say, well, if we do research in order to understand the system, then we can really move towards a new system. And I kind of struggle with that, because we have discussed now that a new system needs also a new narrative, a new dream, however we call it, face, love. So I was kind of just intrigued that you had this as a very important step, at least in your book.
Yeah, I haven't read my own book for a long time, Antoinette, so I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think you already told us that you move beyond emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I still hold it. I mean, I'm interested in people who work. They talk about like Donna Haraway. They talk about beyond human. There's post-human talk. There's people who talk about kind of not having a self and not a non-self. And there's a lot of talk about this, but I mean, my experience is I can't rid myself of myself, you know. So I think, you know, even if I think about multi-species, think about engagement with nature in different ways, think about the entanglements, think about not putting the anthropomorphic kind of way of thinking humans right at the center, we still have a kind of a power in the world, and we bring language to the world and thinking to the world, and we have to kind of accept responsibility for that. So I think emancipation is still part of that language. You know, I still think Black Lives Matter do matter. I think, you know, I think emancipation movements do matter. Social movements do matter. I think we have to engage in it, but I don't think we have to get trapped in just a modernist version that if like this will lead to progress and then we get kind of a classist society or a utopian society. I don't think that's helpful.
So I will try to get us from here to the end, because I know we're over time, but I mean, thank you, Simon. What a fascinating conversation. I love this. I want to I will probably try to get to 3 questions. So the first question is Greta, Lenin, societal and revolutionary change. In the context, let me throw in a few things that I have on my list. Symptoms and attractors and symbolism. So how are there some mechanisms of social change? What is the symbolic meaning of Greta? And how does it link to revolutionary theory if we look back at some of the examples that we have in history? And you're writing about both Lenin, but also about Zapatistas, for example. So some of these new social movements and so on. So is there some learning? Is there some significance that we should extract from this?
I think to learn from social movements is very important. I think social movements have driven change in the past, and I think it's like leadership from the edges. It's marginal people, So I got interested in Greta. It's a phenomenal story. A troubled young girl, basically, sat outside a Parliament building with a placard, which became a mass movement. I mean, it's a phenomenal story, and I got kind of interested in why Greta. Why did the world make her their leader?
Is it not like a saint? Is it like Maria? Is there not some pureness and?
Yeah. I mean, the study I did, the research I did, in the paper I wrote, talked about kind of how we project onto her and how we kind of make sense of our own understandings of what's going on, and how she represents vulnerability. She presents as vulnerable. She talks about her mental health issues. She talks about she looks vulnerable. She looks younger than she was. She stands in these great auditoriums, and I think her vulnerability plays back to society, how they feel vulnerable in the face of environmental change. I talk about her being about power, and how that vulnerability doesn't mean that you're powerless, that she kind of uses it in a way, she turns the world upside down, that she kind of inverts the world. So a young girl berating the most powerful people in the UN, telling them why are you making me be the only adult in the room? Why aren't you the adults in the room? She inverts the world, and she reflects back to us that the world is actually turned upside down anyway. She's that the world is we've obscenely kind of used nature in a way which has been so damaging. We've obscenely kind of used people in different ways, and what her message, I think, is the world needs another kind of revolution. It does need to be turned upside down again, because at the moment it's kind of it's the mess we made through modernity is going to destroy us all. So I think she kind of plays these messages back to us, and come on Monday and have a listen. But it's
we unfortunately we'll be in another interview with a very, very interesting guest, Margit, an economist who will challenge some of the corporate governance in our current system. But we will listen to the recording. I think there's a lot of symbolism that also is, again, a religious or spiritual connotation, maybe, that I'm wondering how we can use it, not in a manipulative way, maybe, but in a way that we can challenge some of the power structures.
Yeah, I mean, with Greta, I did say that she is the kind of a projected new Joan of Arc. She does take that sort of that innocent, that purity, that voice, and I also said that she's it's about non-patriarchy. She's not kind of a feminist, but she stands up and she symbolizes not patriarchy, the opposite to patriarchy, a young woman's voice there. So all that is at play, and I'll explore that.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I'll move us to the final question, and maybe two questions on good organizations, and then we will close. So again, very fascinating. You I think anticipated some of the very turbulent conversations we're having about leaderless. Right. And I think a lot of these system debates that we're having very often with somewhat ideological people, and you described that in the anarchist movements, who are against authority. And I think you very effectively described that actually leaderless is not quite the point. And what you describe also resonates to a degree with Amy Edmondson's work on self-managed organizations. You actually need, she writes, clear structures and decision-making processes. If you distribute power, you need to understand how that works. And I just wonder if you could take us back to the Quakers and spiritual consensus, but explain the notion of, in your mind, how could we create organizations that represent your eco-leadership approach? And I would love you to just explain the notion of containment has to be provided to allow for distributed leadership.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fantasy around leaderlessness, getting rid of power, getting rid of authority, and as Foucault said, power is everywhere. Anyway, you don't get rid of it. It's just how it's used and how it's taken up. So it's about doing that in the most transparent way we can. So we're always trying to make the hidden available to us. The way the Quakers work is interesting, because they don't vote, so they don't vote, have a voting consensus. They sit and they wait. And one of the most interesting experiences I ever had really was when I went to an annual meeting with probably 5,000 or 6,000 Quakers in Britain, yearly meeting, and they were debating the idea of gay marriage. And all the churches were debating this. This is like maybe 15 years ago or something, 20 years ago, I can't remember. And this is a very contentious issue. You know, in faith communities, this is very, you know, we had the liberal progressives who kind of were actively for it, and there's a lot of gay people in the Quaker movement who, you know, were fighting for this. And then you had kind of people who were quoting the scriptures and saying that, you know, that this can't be, you know, it's in the Bible, it shouldn't be. And so you had that kind of debate going on, and the question was, you know, how could this ever be resolved with 6,000 people reaching consensus? It just doesn't work. And it was amazing. And what happened was the Quaker church became the first church in Britain to vote for gay marriage. And this process seemingly went on for years. It felt like it was going on for years, this discussion going back and forth. And eventually at one meeting, they went down, and the idea of spiritual consensus is you give your spirit up to the whole, to the community. So you follow the leading of the spirit. It's not about your own individual ego or your individual kind of voice. You know, you follow the leading of the spirit. And actually, in the end, people came to a consensus that this is what the Quaker movement should do, support this. And it was, I remember being there, and it was just such a powerful moment. People giving up their own ego, their own position, because the leading of the spirit led to a new way. And although it seemed to take for ages, the Quakers got there quicker than any of the hierarchical churches who were trying to make decisions on it. You know, that they followed 5-10 years later. It's interesting. You know, so this consensual process actually led to a kind of more speedier kind of resolution than the hierarchies. But to see that. And you can learn a lot from that you're not just kind of going for a vote or a majority. You're actually trying to put yourself in a collective position and seeing where the spirit leads you. And I think that's quite a different way of understanding change. And the Quakers have been doing that for 400 or 500 years now, and it's and they're still there and they're still going. It's that's been their way of working. It's phenomenal.
Very, very interesting. I think lots for us to talk and take away, think about and take away. But we have completely overrun on our time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close us off. But before doing so, as I think Simon is also kind of teaching us in his courses, that closure is important. And I think I want to offer an opportunity for closure for the three of us, and then go into closure with you, Simon. So to close us off, maybe just a kind of 1 minute round to resurface the key themes that we have taken from the last hour, or add anything final that we really wanted to bring in. So again, I will try to give you a little bit of thinking time by throwing in the things that I have. So I think leadership, firstly, the concept of leadership in the way that Simon has requalified it as a psychosocial influencing dynamic, something that is between leaders and followers, and Simon calls these participants. Even the notion of follower might not be quite right. I think that is something that we can step into and sense in the moment much more carefully in the way that we are normally. And I think that becomes almost a precondition to be able to step into this eco-leadership capability and dialogue, sense the system around, understanding very, very carefully what stance we want to take in this system. Then I think we talked about the monastic formation. I think that is a key thought. Antoinette, we will take up also with Bruno Frey, who has looked at monasteries in particular, and see what learning is there. I love the idea of Greta and the symbolism that it brings, and I'll be looking forward to listening to that. We didn't touch on the role of academia, but when you talked about dependency culture, I think Antoinette already brought some of I think she agrees with that which is another very interesting discussion. And finally, this notion of leaderless is really not what it's all about. That might also be something we need to investigate in terms of power. But this ability to let the spirit lead, give our spirit to the community, and become a representative almost of the whole system, I think is something really beautiful that I'm taking away. Antoinette?
Yes, I would agree to all of that, and you put it also into very nice words. I think in addition, for me, important is indeed this question: how do these different discourses prevail? How can they kind of coexist? Is it balancing? Is it kind of finding a third way how to work with it? So that to me is a very important part. I'm also taking away particularly for the way we conduct leadership development at universities, we're far off from what you are suggesting, because yes, we do talk a little bit about distributed leadership, but we exactly don't understand it that way. Needless to say that also, of course, the experience-based learning and the action-based learning would be something to take on board, but I think it becomes much more important in this ecosystems within ecosystems approach. And for me, I just heard another organization I really would like to understand. If we are thinking about operationalizing goodness, whatever goodness is, I would like to understand more about the Quakers. So that's something I'm really interested now.
Good. Well, I'm taking some clarity from this. We've covered a huge amount of ground, but I think for me, there's two really keys to kind of what we've been discussing, and one is a re-enchantment and bringing a spirit-led transformation and change, and that's not. I have a big problem with some of the way spirituality is brought into organizational thinking, and it can become very instrumental. It become very fetishized. It become like very idealized, or romanticized. But I do think we have to kind of re-enchant the world in our own lives, through our own experiences, through our relationships, to nature, and I think that will kind of that is a huge part of the shift we need to do. And I think, as Hannah Arendt kind of says, to think differently, we have to kind of train our minds to go visiting. And I think we get very caught up in our own worlds and our own kind of social constructs, and we have to kind of go beyond that. I think that's kind of something I've been working with for the last couple of years, about how I think I'm quite a progressive or open thinker, but I realize just how stuck I am in certain ways of thinking still, and I have to keep challenging myself to kind of find new ways.
Staying with the trouble, as you have told us in your courses, I think it's probably very wise to always watch us. And tomorrow we will talk with Bill Torbert, and one thing that I really love about him, he's written one important book, which is The Power of Balance, and it's all about power. And what I loved is actually he invited someone who was of a completely contrarian view to himself to write the foreword. And I think that is almost like an embodiment of that logic, to say, I constantly need to stay vigilant of my own thinking.
Nice.
Now, to close us off, finally, we thought it was only appropriate, Simon, that we would, rather than our usual quiz, go with a free association game, where I have like 10 kind of words for you to freely associate. If you just want to throw what first comes to your mind back at us, we will see if Freud was right or not after this, and then we will close it out. So I will start with a few words. Virtue.
Goodness.
Spiritual leadership.
Insight.
Power.
Everywhere.
Discourse.
Beneath the surface.
Mindfulness.
Problematic.
Desire.
Yes, please.
Life.
Living.
Trump.
Stuck.
Containment.
Thoughtfulness.
And finally, symptom.
Essence.
Wonderful. And with that, Simon, I cannot thank you enough for having taken all this time. And I think this has really showed what we are intending to do with these sessions as a form of dialogue to create new thinking. I think thanks to you, we've really come out of this with some new ideas. So again, a big thank you on our behalf. I hope it was useful, and wishing everybody else a good rest of the day wherever you are, and speak to you again soon. With
thank you, Antoinette. Great conversation. Loved it.
Thank you very much, everybody. And with that, we are out.